Before I tell you how I became the woman they never saw coming, the woman who turned their arrogant silence into trembling disbelief, make sure to subscribe. Because this story isn't just about pain, it's about how silence can become the sharpest blade, and how revenge, when planned patiently, becomes the quietest kind of justice. Growing up in the Moore household felt less like being raised in a home and more like being drafted into an unspoken war of expectations. Everything we did had to be pristine, polished, presentable, not for our own happiness, but to maintain the illusion of perfection that my parents built their entire identities around. My father, Martin Moore, was the kind of man who judged value through performance. In his world, if something didn't return a measurable result, it wasn't worth investing in. This applied to stocks, properties, and unfortunately, his daughters. My mother, Claire, while less outwardly aggressive, used her cold elegance like a weapon, constantly making it clear that appearances were currency, and that any deviation from what society deemed admirable was simply unacceptable. And then there was Naomi, my older sister, an exact clone of everything my parents ever praised: conventionally attractive, socially magnetic, academically sharp, and ambitious in the exact way they wanted, shallow, marketable, and relentlessly status-driven. In their eyes, I wasn't just the black sheep of the family. I was a stain. I didn't share their obsession with luxury or reputation. I didn't care about networking luncheons, expensive handbags, or finding a man with a surname that sounded like old money. Instead, I cared about things they couldn't see or touch: algorithms, encryption, online threats, and digital justice. From the time I was a teenager, I found solace in systems and patterns, in pulling apart code and putting it back together until it obeyed my will. But in a family like mine, that kind of brilliance meant nothing unless it could be worn to a dinner party or posted on Instagram. The final confrontation happened over dinner, one of those absurdly elaborate family meals where no one really talked, but everyone pretended they enjoyed each other's company for the sake of optics. My father was swirling a glass of overpriced red wine while lecturing Naomi about expanding her pharmaceutical client list, and I was just sitting there, tuning it all out, rehearsing the words I'd been holding back for weeks. "I got accepted," I said finally, breaking the illusion of harmony. "A full scholarship to the European School of Cybersecurity. It's in Berlin. Government-funded. Top tier." The room fell into a kind of silence that wasn't just quiet, it was judgmental. My father's brow furrowed as if I'd announced that I'd been recruited into a cult. Claire blinked slowly, setting her fork down like it had become contaminated. Naomi didn't even bother hiding the smirk that crept across her face. Martin leaned forward, lacing his fingers together with the kind of forced calm that always came before a condescending lecture. "Alara, let's be honest. That's not a real future. What do you expect to do with whatever this is? Spend your life hunched over a computer, chasing criminals who don't exist." "It's cybersecurity, Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "It's real. It's necessary. It's one of the fastest-growing fields in the world." Claire let out a sigh that carried enough disdain to kill a conversation outright. "You've always had this fixation on being difficult," she said, stirring her glass of mineral water like it might offer her a more agreeable daughter. "You could have followed Naomi's path. Pharmaceuticals, public speaking, corporate consulting, respectable careers." "I don't want that," I replied. "I never did." Naomi laughed under her breath and finally spoke. "You've never wanted anything that made sense. You barely brush your hair, Alara. You wear secondhand clothes and build stupid websites. No one's going to take you seriously. Not looking like that." Her words didn't sting the way they used to. I'd already built a wall around myself, brick by brick, formed from every insult they had thrown at me since I was 13. But I still remember how they all looked at me in that moment. Not like I was brave or talented or different in a way that mattered, but like I was delusional, like I was a walking embarrassment who needed to be quietly erased from the narrative they presented to the world. "I'm leaving in 3 days," I said simply, pushing my chair back. "You don't have to understand." "I'm not asking for your support." Martin stood up, towering behind his chair with an expression that looked like disappointment and fury wrapped into one. You leave this house with that attitude, and you don't come back, he warned. You think life is about independence and dreams? It's about loyalty, about being useful to the people who raised you. Claire didn't stop him. Naomi didn't defend me. And so I walked away, not just from the table, but from the years of emotional manipulation and conditional love I had suffered in silence. I packed one bag, left behind everything that tied me to that house, photos, letters, memories, and stepped into the cold without waiting for anyone to chase me. Berlin was not kind at first. The city was gray and unwelcoming. The language was foreign to my ears, and the cold seemed to seep into my bones every night I spent in my cramped apartment, which had cracked walls, a broken heater, and a bed that groaned with every movement. I lived on cheap instant noodles, wore thrift store sweaters, and kept gloves on while typing because my fingers would go numb from the cold. But I had my laptop, I had the network, and most of all, I had purpose. Classes turned into internships. Internships turned into contracts. And before I knew it, I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. By the time I turned 26, I was one of the youngest agents involved in a European-wide digital surveillance task force focused on money laundering, cryptocurrency abuse, and black market digital finance operations. I learned how to trace hidden trails, how to break apart offshore accounts disguised behind layers of deception, and how to do it all without ever being seen. I wasn't just a Lara anymore. I was the ghost in the machine that corporations feared and governments relied on. Then, one night, while reviewing a cluster of flagged shell companies funneling cash through 3 different continents, I saw something that stopped me cold. The company names meant nothing at first, just another web of fraud, but when I dug deeper into the document signatures, the transaction records, and the consultant names tied to those structures, a name emerged. More Enterprises. At first, I thought it had to be a coincidence. Maybe my father had invested in a fund that got compromised. But as I followed the digital breadcrumbs, VPN IPs traced to family properties, email headers spoofed but poorly hidden, financial ties that lined up too perfectly to be random, I saw that it wasn't just some side investment. It was deliberate, coordinated, carefully hidden, and Naomi's name was all over it. Suddenly, everything they had ever said to me, every time they mocked me for caring about fake internet crime, every smirk, every sneer, they all became evidence. Not just of their cruelty, but of their arrogance. They never thought I would be capable enough, clever enough, or successful enough to be in a position to uncover their secrets. They underestimated me. And in doing so, they made the fatal mistake of leaving themselves vulnerable to someone who knew them better than any auditor or agent ever could. So, I did something I never imagined I'd do again. I booked a ticket home. I didn't announce it. I didn't call ahead. I just walked through the airport like a shadow returning to where it had once been unwanted, carrying nothing but a black coat, a hardened mind, and an unshakable purpose. When I rang the bell of the Moore family estate, now even more obscenely renovated than I remembered, Naomi answered the door. Her expression melted in real time from self-assured indifference to a sharp-edged panic. Alara? She blinked, as if trying to determine if I was real or a memory. I smiled, calm, deliberate.
Naomi.
Mind if I come in? She hesitated only a second before stepping aside. You look different. Inside, the house smelled the same. Expensive perfume, polished floors, and the kind of artificial sterility that money could buy but love never built. Claire was sitting in the drawing room, wearing pearls and silk like armor. She stood abruptly when she saw me. Martin entered moments later, his face blank, calculating. You've returned, he said, as if I'd left to run an errand instead of walking away from their lives completely. I have, I answered, stepping forward with measured grace. For a little while, at least. There was no mention of the years I'd been gone, no apology, no questions about my success or safety. Instead, Naomi, clearly desperate to regain control, chimed in with false enthusiasm. We're hosting a business gala next week, Moore Enterprises Quarterly Summit. Investors, partners, media, it's a big deal. You should come. It might help reintroduce you. Reintroduce me? I looked around the room. The same chandeliers. The same cold smiles. The same people, still clinging to their masks. I nodded slowly. Sounds lovely. I'd be honored to attend. And just like that, I was back where they thought I'd never belong. Only they had no idea that the game had already begun, and that the person they once cast out was now the one holding all the cards. If you're still with me, then you've only seen the first crack in the surface. Subscribe now, because what comes next will leave you breathless. The invitation came not from guilt, nor from love, but from pride. A shallow, desperate attempt to dress up their past cruelty and parade me around like a trophy they didn't earn. Naomi extended it over wine and soft jazz in the sunroom the day after I returned, calling it a family gesture and insisting it would be good optics for me to attend the More Enterprises Quarterly Summit, a black-tie gala attended by investors, executives, and socialites who valued smiles over substance. I knew immediately why they wanted me there. It wasn't about me. It never was. It was about fixing their narrative. The one where I had vanished in disgrace, allegedly off somewhere wasting my life in obscurity, only to suddenly reappear, with a refined look, a controlled demeanor, and just enough mystery in my eyes to make people wonder if they'd misjudged me. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know I'd spent the last 6 years climbing to a level of power they couldn't comprehend, one that didn't come with magazine covers or Instagram likes, but came with silence, access, and influence that slipped through firewalls and undetected networks like smoke in a locked room. They didn't know that the reason I accepted the invitation wasn't to make peace. It was to finish what I started. The gala was scheduled at the Hyatt Regency, one of the most luxurious hotels in the city, where chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from 30-foot ceilings, and every inch of floor space was polished until it gleamed like gold. Guests would arrive in cars worth more than most homes, dressed in custom-tailored suits and glittering dresses, ready to sip cocktails while exchanging empty flattery and financial gossip. Claire insisted I let her handle my styling for the event, calling in one of her trusted fashion advisors, as if a little makeup and a designer dress would somehow erase the past they had written me out of. I agreed, of course, letting her believe she was helping me reclaim something I had lost, when in truth, it was only fueling the illusion I needed her to believe in. The evening of the gala, I walked into the Hyatt's grand ballroom with the kind of calculated confidence I had learned from years of being invisible, when to hold eye contact, when to smile softly, when to listen instead of speak. The room was filled with hundreds of people who didn't know me, didn't recognize me, but glanced my way with the kind of curiosity that lingers just long enough to leave a trail. Martin stood near the podium, shaking hands and performing like the political CEO he had always wanted to be. Naomi flitted between groups like a butterfly desperate for light, her laughter just loud enough to be heard, her charm rehearsed to the syllable. Claire sat with a small crowd of wives and socialites, discussing schools, yachts, and vacation homes like they were headlines in a local tabloid. I didn't belong there. And that was the point. I stood near the back of the ballroom, sipping sparkling water and watching them from a distance, letting them bask in the delusion that I had finally come home, because I had matured, because I had finally accepted their way of life, because I was willing to be one of them. If only they knew the real reason I was there. An hour into the evening, just as the wine had started to loosen everyone's posture and lower their inhibitions, I spotted a familiar face entering from the side hallway, Detective Rowan Vex, dressed in a black suit and tie, clean-shaven, with eyes sharp enough to cut through glass. He moved like a man trained to observe without drawing attention, and while no one else in that room knew his name, I knew exactly what his presence meant. The surveillance had been completed. The investigation was active. And tonight, everything was about to begin. We had spent the last 4 months quietly building a case that trace-laundered funds from shell companies across 3 jurisdictions, all funneling back to an account linked to More Enterprises through an alias Naomi had registered using fake consultant credentials and off-book contracts. She wasn't alone. Martin's digital signature had appeared in authorization documents, and Claire had received coded wire transfers under the name of a fake charity. It wasn't just corruption. It was a systemic abuse of financial power, complete with fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. And they had no idea the person who found them out was the daughter they had once thrown away. I waited until Martin stepped off the stage after giving his speech, a tired monologue about integrity in the face of innovation, and approached him casually, smiling with the kind of politeness that disarmed without warning. "Wonderful words, Dad," I said softly. "Very inspiring." He looked surprised, but flattered. "Thank you, Alara. I'm glad you came. You look impressive." "I have something to share too, actually," I replied, tilting my head slightly. Martin raised an eyebrow. "Oh." Without a word, I gestured to the technicians standing near the AV controls. He glanced at me, then back at Rowan, and after a barely perceptible nod, he tapped a key. The ballroom screen, meant to display more Enterprise's highlights, flickered, and then went dark. A few guests paused mid-conversation. Then the screen lit up again, showing a series of screenshots, documents, financial statements, login records, account transfers, all overlaid with dates, transaction IDs, and names that appeared one after another. Moore Enterprises. Naomi Moore. Martin Moore. Claire Moore. A stunned silence swept across the room like a sudden wind. The soft hum of conversations died. Forks hovered midair. Eyes widened as familiar names became criminal evidence in high definition. Naomi turned, her mouth slightly open, frozen. Claire dropped her champagne flute, the glass shattering at her feet. And Martin didn't move. He simply stared, jaw clenched, as the voiceover on the screen began a formal summary of the investigation, narrating the exact charges under review by international authorities.
Fraud.
Money laundering. Embezzlement. Rowan stepped forward, flashing a badge under his suit coat. A few more agents emerged quietly from the exits, circulating through the room, polite but firm. I turned to Martin and spoke softly enough that only he could hear me. "You remember when you told me that loyalty meant being useful to the people who raised me?"
He didn't speak.
"I am useful," I whispered. "Just not in the way you expected." If you're just now realizing where this is heading, take a moment to subscribe. Because the silence that's coming, it's the kind that changes everything. Naomi tried to speak, stumbling forward with a half-baked excuse about fake documents and misunderstandings, but the moment she raised her voice, the entire ballroom was already watching her with a mix of confusion and disgust. She wasn't the darling anymore. She wasn't the image of success. She was the face on the evidence. Claire's voice trembled as she stepped toward me, years of performance cracking in a single sentence. You did this?" "I revealed it," I replied. "You did it." Rowan nodded at me once before stepping toward the Moore family, calmly beginning the process of questioning and containment. No one was being arrested yet. This wasn't about spectacle. This was about warning them that the walls were closing in, that the game was no longer in their control. And as the whispers began spreading through the ballroom like wildfire, executives realizing what was happening, socialites backing away, partners beginning to draft their exits. I stood completely still, sipping the last of my drink. Not a raised voice. Not a dramatic confrontation. Just truth, delivered in the quietest, most elegant ambush they never saw coming. They thought I came back to prove myself. But I didn't return to reclaim a seat at their table. I returned to burn the table down and build something unshakable from the ashes. So if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe. Because the next chapter will show you what happens when the family disgrace becomes the one name they can't outrun. The press coverage hit faster than I anticipated. Within 24 hours of the gala, the Moore family's name was no longer trending for its philanthropic fundraisers or investment announcements. It was headlining every major outlet with phrases like ongoing investigation, fraud suspicions, and multi-million-dollar laundering probe. Every crisp photograph they'd once posed for, every magazine spread Claire had proudly framed above the fireplace, was now buried under headlines that made their perfectly preserved reputations start to rot from the inside out. But they didn't fall apart all at once. That's not how masks drop. They crack. The first fracture came the following morning when Martin attempted damage control with an emergency board meeting. I knew this because someone inside the company, a junior analyst who had been quietly rooting for my investigation from the start, forwarded me the minutes, typed frantically with timestamps, panicked questions, and board members asking how deep the corruption really went. Martin had shown up in the same suit from the gala, tie askew, hair uncombed, trying to downplay what had been publicly confirmed by federal agents the night before. "It's a misunderstanding," he reportedly said. "A smear campaign by a rogue digital consultant who wants to damage our legacy." That rogue consultant was me. And that legacy? It was bleeding from every crack he'd spent decades denying existed. Naomi, meanwhile, had gone completely silent. Her public relations firm tried releasing a carefully worded statement denying all allegations and suggesting the documents shown at the gala had been digitally manipulated. But the attempt was weak, and within hours, the agency withdrew their representation entirely. Once sponsors and press get even the scent of public scandal, they scatter like rats from a burning ship. Claire didn't leave the house. She sat in the same armchair for days, clutching her phone, waiting for someone to call and offer a lifeline. But all she got were reporters on the line and socialites pretending not to know her name. While they scrambled to protect themselves, I remained exactly where I needed to be, unseen but ever present. My role was never to shout their sins from rooftops. That would have been too dramatic, too shallow. No, my job was to make sure every lock came undone one turn at a time. The audit teams were already deep inside Moore Enterprises' financial systems, tracing inconsistencies, matching signatures, and flagging offshore payments hidden behind foundations that didn't even exist outside of paper. There's something poetic about watching a house fall from within. One afternoon, I returned to the estate, not to provoke them, but because Rowan asked me to retrieve some personal documents tied to the digital evidence cache. I could have let agents do it, but I wanted to walk through that door once more, not as the forgotten daughter or the family disgrace, but as the one holding the final nails for the coffin they had built with their own egos. The air inside the house was different now. Gone was the scent of lavender polish and imported flowers. It had been replaced by tension, bitter, metallic, and impossible to ignore. I walked past the grand staircase and saw Claire on the living room couch, surrounded by empty glasses, her makeup slightly smeared from lack of sleep. She didn't say a word when she saw me, just stared. Martin emerged from his office a moment later, his posture stiff, eyes dull. He looked like a man on the verge of understanding that everything he built was no longer his to protect. "Is this what you wanted?" he asked, voice rasping, tone far too calm for a man whose empire was collapsing.
No, irraplia.
"This is what you chose." He swallowed hard, but didn't respond. "I didn't make those payments, Martin," I continued, emphasizing his first name just enough to make it sting. "I didn't sign those accounts. I didn't commit fraud in 6 countries. You did." Claire stood up suddenly. "You humiliated us, Alara," she snapped, voice brittle. "You did this publicly. You could have." Her words caught in her throat, cracking under years of repressed rage and social anxiety. "You could have come to us directly. We're your family." The word family hit the air like a bad smell. I stepped forward and let the silence stretch long enough to pull the truth out with it. "When I came to you with my future, you dismissed it," I said, slow and deliberate. "When I left, you erased me. And now that I've come back with the truth, you want mercy?" Claire's lip trembled, but she didn't answer. "You didn't raise a daughter. You raised an illusion," I continued. "One you could shape, silence, and discard when it didn't suit your narrative. But people like me,
We don't vanish.
we wait, we evolve, and eventually we come back, only not for validation, for justice." Naomi entered the room from the side hallway, barefoot, dressed in a silk robe that looked thrown on rather than chosen. Her eyes were red, her voice tired and venomous. "You've ruined us, Alara." I met her glare with a calm that had taken years to build. "No," I said. "You did that all by yourself. I just opened the curtains." That night, The news aired the first televised report featuring parts of the gala's evidence presentation. Footage of the ballroom, the stunned faces, the documents on the big screen. Everything was shown in clear, unforgiving detail. Analysts began breaking down the scandal on live broadcasts, with financial experts speculating on how much of more enterprises would survive and which international agencies would press charges first. And still, I remained in the background.
No interviews.
No comments. No press releases. Because silence, when used correctly, becomes louder than any headline. The only person who truly understood that was Rowan. We met for dinner in a quiet corner of a bistro, away from the city's chaos, where he handed me a final document, one confirming the full seizure of Naomi's personal assets tied to fraudulent commissions. "It's done," he said, sipping his tea. "They can't touch anything else." We traced it all. I took the file slowly, nodding once. "Thank you. You don't have to keep disappearing, you know," Rowan added, almost gently. "You could go public. Take credit. Everyone loves a good revenge story." But I shook my head. "This wasn't about revenge," I replied. "It was about showing them who I became without their permission. If you've come this far, watching how the truth unraveled piece by piece, and you're still with me, then subscribe. Because the final chapter is where they finally face what they never thought would happen. Not punishment, not disgrace, but irrelevance. There's something most people never admit out loud. It's not the fall that breaks you. It's the moment you realize no one's going to catch you. In the days that followed the televised exposure, more enterprises didn't crumble in dramatic fashion. There was no single, satisfying moment where their headquarters collapsed into flames or the family was dragged away in handcuffs to the sound of cameras clicking. That's not how reality works. Reputations rot from the inside out. One sponsor withdraws. One board member resigns. One by one, names are removed from invitations from committees, from trust funds and power circles.
The Moores didn't vanish overnight.
They simply started becoming invisible. It began when the company's largest investor, a Hong Kong-based equity firm, issued a public statement severing ties with more enterprises until legal clarity could be achieved. The stock tanked within hours. Banks froze international transfers. Claire's art club disinvited her from a private gala she'd helped organize for over a decade. Naomi's photo vanished from pharmaceutical banners. Her name was removed from the keynote list at the regional conference where she was supposed to speak. No one wanted to be associated with them, not even the people who had once bragged about knowing them. And through it all, I remained silent. I didn't speak to the press. I didn't answer messages from distant cousins suddenly curious about how I was doing. I didn't respond to journalistic inquiries framed like friendly emails. I wasn't doing this for fame, for clicks, or for social media applause. I was doing it because they needed to see the world without the illusion they spent their whole lives clinging to. A world where their daughter didn't need them. A world where her name, once discarded and mocked, now quietly controlled conversations they weren't even invited to. 1 week after the gala, I returned to the estate one last time, not out of obligation, but for closure. The front gates, once immaculately polished and guarded by motion sensors and a paid security firm, now stood slightly ajar. A sign hung crookedly to one side, its brass tarnished by weather. Inside, the house felt like a museum after the war. The flowers were gone. The staff had been reduced. The silence didn't hum with superiority anymore. It sat heavy, awkward, like a forgotten promise. Claire was in the kitchen, stirring a cup of tea with a kind of absent-minded detachment, wearing a wool cardigan that looked older than anything I remembered her owning. Her eyes, once razor-sharp with judgment, now just looked tired. I don't think she even registered I had walked in at first. "Ilara," she said quietly after a moment, voice hoarse. "Hi, Mom." She hesitated. "We haven't spoken since the news." "Not really." "I know. Is it true?" she asked. "Everything they're saying?" "More than you want to believe," I answered. She didn't protest.
She didn't deflect.
She just lowered her gaze and nodded slowly. stirring her tea like she needed the motion to keep her thoughts from unraveling. "I didn't know it would go this far," she whispered. "Martin, Naomi, they always talked about optics, positioning, what people needed to believe. I just assumed. You assumed silence was safer." I finished for her. "You assumed if you looked the other way, the mess would never reach you." She blinked quickly, trying not to let the tears fall. "You could have destroyed us entirely," she said, her voice steadier now. "You could have gone further, called for arrests, told the world everything." "I could have," I replied. "But that's not what I wanted." Claire looked up, confusion etched between her wrinkles. "Then what did you want?" "I wanted you to see what it's like to be erased," I said. "To walk into a room and feel like you don't matter. To be looked through, ignored, unseen. I wanted you to sit in that silence you once made me live in. To realize what it means when people stop pretending you exist." She covered her mouth with one hand, holding back a sob. But I didn't flinch. I didn't soften. I simply turned and walked down the hallway I used to tiptoe through, heading toward the study where Martin spent most of his days pretending to be busy. He was at his desk, hunched over a closed laptop, dressed in a loose, wrinkled shirt with no tie, an image that would have once made him rage against a mirror. His eyes flicked up when I entered. He didn't rise. "Ilara," he said flatly. "Martin," I answered. His mouth twitched, but he didn't challenge me on the name. "They're going to finish it," he said. "The agencies, the legal teams, they're going to bury everything." "Eventually, yes," I agreed. "You'll either be fined into irrelevance or hung out to dry by your own shareholders." He leaned back, arms crossed. "Is that what you wanted all along? My name in the dirt?" "No," I said. "I wanted you to lose your grip on power, on people, on the illusion that you could treat anyone, especially your own daughter, as expendable." He said nothing. I took a deep breath. "You told me once that loyalty meant being useful to the people who raised you, that if I wasn't useful, I was worthless." He nodded slowly. "Yes." "Well," I said, walking to the doorway, "now you know what it feels like to be the one who's no longer useful." I left him in silence. He didn't call after me. He didn't plead. Maybe he knew better. Or maybe he finally understood that silence can be more terrifying than rage, because it means you no longer have power. As I stepped out into the sunlight, I saw Naomi in the garden, seated alone on the bench where we used to fight over books and whisper secrets before it all turned cold. Her posture was stiff. Her shoulders hunched. Her phone lay on the bench beside her untouched. She was no longer the golden child, no longer the flawless sister. She was just a woman out of armor. She looked up as I passed. "Is this it?" she asked. "Is this what you needed?" I stopped walking. "I needed to remember who I am," I said. "And make sure you never forget it again." She stared at me for a long moment. "You think this makes you better than us?" "No," I replied. "I've always been better. You're just finally catching up." I didn't wait for her response, because I didn't need one. Closure doesn't come with apologies. It comes with clarity. And I had never seen the world more clearly than in that moment. I walked away from the Moore estate for the final time. Not as a disgrace, not as a victim, not even as a survivor. I walked away as a woman who had rebuilt herself in silence, sharpened herself in solitude, and returned not for revenge, but for reckoning. And they never saw me coming. So if this story hit you somewhere deep, if you've ever been made to feel like your worth depended on approval, or your silence was the only way to survive, then subscribe. Because this channel, it's for the ones who were underestimated, until the moment they decided to speak.